So good evening. Thank you for whoever's braved traffic. Um, it is a pretty long trip. So I know lots of people have come from Delhi. Well, I have. And so have you.
Yes. Maybe some people come to the tri-state area.
Yes.
Haryana, Gurgaon, Noida.
Of course.
And Delhi.
I mean, is there somebody from Noida?
I don't know.
Okay, that's serious commitment. But here, so good evening.
Maybe worth it.
It really is. I mean, I think in terms of just to go with the theme of the book about equality, there should be somebody from Noida, right?
That's diversity.
That's a diversity, that's true. But equal representation, is that equality?
Well, why this Noida in that case? Then we should spread our tentacles a bit further.
Yeah, but it's UP, Haryana, and Delhi. Yeah. So, I mean, it could be
I'm alluding to the
Ghaziabad.
tri-state area as in New York, where I think people will be more familiar with here.
Yeah. So,
Sure, let's start.
okay. So, good evening, and I think that everybody would have got a drink, and I think we should just start launching on the conversation. So I think let's start with what we started off with from the first thing, where I think that I think the book is really important, and it comes at a particularly important time. And you've said that you've spent 2 years writing, so it isn't sort of an engineered important time, right? But you know, at the heart of the book, of course, and you talk about the Constitution, and that's really the hero of the book, you talk about equality. And we were talking about how, in some ways, equality, if you look at all the other rights, and you look at freedom of expression, which is sort of a hot press button issue. That's what everybody wants, right? This freedom to express themselves. Why does equality, in some ways, is like the stepsister of right? Why doesn't anybody take it that seriously, and why should we?
Well, equality is not the sexy right?
Yeah.
Freedom of speech makes headlines because typically people sitting in this room, all of us value freedom of speech because we have it, so we know when it's taken away.
Yeah.
So when there's a chilling effect because of status coming after you, someone goes after Twitter, someone who's speaking can no longer speak. That's an abridgment of your right that you currently have.
Yeah.
Because we all come from a strata society, generally,
and
that freedom exists. And its attenuation becomes very obvious. You either have it or you don't.
Yeah.
Right? It's an all or nothing kind of a thing, freedom. Equality is qualitatively different. For one, again, because of the fact that you have privilege and you have that freedom, you also have a privilege and superiority. And the idea of equality is when you don't have it, when you are poor.
Yeah, like you talk about the aspect of the fact that most people don't feel caste because most of the people who don't feel caste are upper caste.
And I was seeing that interview by this fantastic woman called Kangana Ranaut. I don't know if you ever heard of her.
Fantastic.
Yes. And
and freedom of expression and on Twitter.
Correct. And she said, I know what people are talking about this caste. And a lot of people think that, that caste, I don't know my caste. Caste doesn't exist in India. Well, when you say something like that, I don't know my caste, it is not a symptom of the fact that caste doesn't exist. It's just that you are from that upper echelon, that you are so privileged, you don't recognize what caste is because you've never felt the effects of inequality.
Yeah.
So that's why inequality is this kind of hard right, which is only perceived when you are facing discrimination. Right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're just going about your daily lives. Inequality suits you if you are come from a rich person. If you're an upper caste person, if you're a man, if you're wealthy, if you are straight, all these are plus points.
Yeah.
Why would you think of inequality?
Yeah.
You got it all. You hit that jackpot. So therefore, equality doesn't seem that important. But it has pernicious effects. It's like a termite. It's just hollowing out the entire polity of our country. You can't build a tiny elite in the top who are completely unequal, like Animal Farm, whatever you can talk about. You cannot create a stable society where you have a few wealthy people who hold all the power, who are from, as I said, upper caste, men, heterosexual, etc., Hindu. Let's add that to the mix. And think that there won't be some problem somewhere on the edifice on which this is all resting. So that's why I think equality is important. Not just to ensure justice and fairness and etc., but also to ensure that the society which we have today remains stable. You take it for granted. You take stability for granted. You think nothing will ever happen. No, there's nothing stopping the hordes from entering into your house if they decide to do that. The only thing that really stops it is a conviction that you live in a legal system that is just and fair, which stops people. A bit of the fear of the police maybe as well. But even that is not always the case, as we've seen. Maybe when you have extremist movements, that doesn't happen. That can break down very quickly. We've seen movements across the country, across the world, which very quickly will become like Bangladesh recently. You don't need much for things to just fall apart. So you want to make sure that you have equality where people are committed in the system and have enough vested in the system that they're morally committed to upholding it. And they won't be the ones destroying it. So equality, therefore, is one of the most essential rights, I would say.
So, but I mean, you're saying that you can't really have a society which is based on inequality, where you can't be straight, casteless and this thing. Essentially, people like us. But I think actually we have created very much of society. Look at Gurgaon, look at Delhi. We've created this world, and now we're expecting this. So my question really is, in some ways, that the book is really the idea of equality. And I think what I really want to ask, do you think it is also very much an older, much more quaint, a much more worthy, noble idea that somehow doesn't really fit into the world today? And how do you look at that as justice? I mean, as someone who's a lawyer, is law about, is it really about justice, or is it about winning? So how do you link the aspect of equality sort of being almost quaint and almost an aspirational thing, like, the good old days when you should do this type of thing, rather than freedom of expression, because we all worry about that, because all of us are on our phones and we all want to say what we want, and outrage is what...
Yeah, you see, equality and a fight for equality stems from empathy, and the fight for freedom stems from self-preservation.
Yeah.
The two are focused very differently. Freedom means that you're fearful that someone will come tomorrow and take your own freedom away. They will stop you from speaking. They will stop you from assembling. They will stop you from moving. So that is very self-focused and immediate, and therefore gets a more visceral reaction.
Yeah.
Equality, when you have that privilege, is your moral duty of empathy towards a person who's less privileged. So it's not about you. You feel good about yourself when you do some work for the underprivileged, or someone who's poorer, from a lower caste, etc. But it's always for someone else, right? But I suppose that's one way of looking at it, and therefore it feels less immediate.
Yeah.
Because it's directed to someone else who you may not, you'll feel sorry for the Dalit community in India, but there'll never be a Dalit at your table.
Unless, isn't the next likely Chief Justice supposed to be Dalit?
Yes, he would in fact be the second Dalit Chief Justice.
Yes.
Justice Balakrishnan was the first for 3 years. Justice Gavai, not the next, the one after.
After that.
Yes, but I don't think he's going to be going to any dinner parties generally. And that's again very much the exception. Almost 20% of this country, scheduled castes and tribes, are 20% of our friends from that community? Answer, certainly not. How many Muslim friends do we all have? Probably very few. But you see, it's not still a quaint right. Because if you're a woman, I don't think there's any woman who has felt completely equal to a man.
True.
Right? And if that be the case, can you truly say that equality is a demand for others, or it's a fear? It's 50% of our country is made to feel unequal. Then surely equality is an important right to talk about here and now for ourselves.
Yeah.
And you may still be a man, but you have a mother. I mean, you have this actually no other way of coming in. But you have a mother, you have sisters, you have other friends. I hope you're all empathetic individuals, and you feel if not for the larger community, but for those women. So I think easy to brush aside equality as something staid and boring and really for the statute books or for courts to give their long, lengthy judgments. But its effects are pernicious, especially sexual minorities.
Yeah.
You know, now it's more and more of us are coming out.
Yeah.
A lot of people now have queer friends.
Yes.
I don't know, your parents probably had none. Our generation, we had a few. The young people, they have far more. The kids of today is all open. Now, it's not as though we are manufacturing queer people, right? There's not some machine that suddenly is more efficient now and more queer people are being born. It's that there's
Depends on who you ask.
Well, yes. Some people will hold a regressive view that's an import from the West, and it's happening, but I think that's probably not the case, right?
True.
I don't feel very imported from the West at all. I'm sitting in my kurta pajama, feeling as Indian as they come, and I am. But the point is, it's because there's greater equality in India today for queer people who feel safer in coming out because of that sense of equality, that people are now expressing their identity. They're living good, more fulfilled, happier lives. And that is making all of society better, not just for the queer people. Of course, it's much better for queer people than it was when you were being imprisoned and sent to Kalapani, as the original sentence, Section 377 was. But it's making everyone else's life more joyful. All the friends of queer people, I think they're happier to have them in their lives. You know, we are fabulous.
Yes. When you're listening. So I actually wanted to ask you about equality. I wanted to turn the conversation a little bit differently. So, you know, when you look at the Constitution and you have this very interesting case about equality, and a man from Bombay who chose to challenge equality over prohibition. And do you want to talk about that? Because I think that might be very relevant right now.
Yes.
About whether there is equality and how getting a drink and not only letting the army get a drink was an important part of equality.
That's a case of this Parsi gentleman called Mr. Balsara. And I don't know how many of you know this. Of course, there was prohibition in Gurgaon some many years ago.
Yes.
But there was prohibition.
There's almost now almost prohibition in Delhi. We don't call it that. We just call it a different thing.
We just put them all in jail. And,
yes.
correct.
But there is prohibition in Delhi.
Correct.
Yes. Press Club didn't have beer. I mean, that's pretty much prohibition.
That's height of discrimination.
Totally.
Surely they want sober journalists.
And of course, very close to the Supreme Court. But even then, we haven't really
Not if you enter the Herald portal of the court, you ought to have a shot or two in the morning. Everything goes much better.
Completely.
But this case was interesting. It's in the 50s. One of the first, this author called Rohit Dey has written this book called A People's Constitution. It's about the idea, and I'll come to this case, but I want to just bring it up why he wrote about this case, why I talk about this case, is about how the Constitution is a tool for everybody. It's not just for the lawyers, it's not just for the judges, it's not just for the academics. It has a very immediate impact on all our lives. And just because you don't know it doesn't mean that isn't true, right? So it has actually an effect, and I think everyone should read about it and teach themselves. And he writes in this book about how just after the promulgation of the Constitution in the 50s, the poorest people, the most common people, thelawalas, they're the ones who have the imagination of fundamental rights and started approaching courts and filing all these petitions. So you see these judgments by very average citizens. They're not the big corporations who are going to court asking for their rights. They're the average citizens. So one particular average citizen was Parsi, obviously very fond of his tipple. Let's hide our gin and tonic. And there was a prohibition in Maharashtra at that point of time. So alcohol was not allowed. The only exception to that rule was that if you belonged to the army, you could go to the army mess and buy alcohol. So this Mr. Balsara was rightfully enraged, saying this is complete injustice, complete inequality. How are you treating an army person who's just another citizen like me? When they're going to the mess, they're not doing any soldierly duty, and me going to my club. The Quorum didn't exist then, but wherever they went. And I don't get alcohol, and they do. And the reason this case is interesting is because this was a case of the early 50s. It just shows the limited imagination of the judges. They were just waiting to uphold laws by applying what is called the classification test. And this brings us something interesting about what equality means.
Yeah.
Right? what does it truly mean to be equal? How, no two people are really equal, are they? I mean, you and I are not equal. I'm a man, you're a woman. You're heterosexual, I'm not. So what does it mean to treat someone equally? Because there are innate differences between everybody. And we don't want everyone to be the same as anyone else, right? But if we want everyone to be able to be different, what does equality mean? Does it cease to have any meaning? So the courts kind of bridge that by saying, yes, you have your differences, but when you have those differences, they must be based on some logical differentiation. Right? And the treatment that you are then getting is on the basis of that differentiation. So if you get period leave for women only, that makes sense because you're a woman, a man doesn't have a period, no period leave, you have period leave. Therefore, there is a ground for discrimination because, and what you're trying to remedy by giving the leave has some nexus to that classification. So this Mr. Balsara said, well, it's alcohol, an army officer and me, we're the same. But the court, Supreme Court, the High Court ruled in his favor, struck down the prohibition altogether, saying that this is arbitrary. The Supreme Court upheld it by saying that, well, you're two different classes. How can you compare a civilian who doesn't need alcohol for camaraderie, but for the sake of the armed forces to develop a kind of a culture, they need to go to the mess, and therefore they upheld that classification. The point is that when are two people equal or unequal, very much lies in the mind of the person making that judgment as to what is the relevant criteria. For the judges, if you went to the armed forces, that was a relevant criteria. Therefore, you had to get that special privilege. But today, I don't think that would stand.
Yeah.
So ultimately, that is what this judgment was. And it makes you think about how we all envisage equality. Is it enough to have classification and just find some way, okay, that's why you're different, so we'll be treating you differently? Or do we go beyond that and look at something more substantive and try to unearth the historical inequalities, etc.?
So, taking on from that, I mean, I think you said that in some ways it was the judges, well, bias is my word, not yours. But, I wanted to talk...
Are they biased judges?
Well, no, never. Okay, like there's no... But essentially, I think, okay, so my question really is that in some ways that at the heart of this book and, my sort of provocative questions on equality side is that in some ways, and I'm going to quote from a judgment which we both agreed was like poetry, and I'll do that later, but my question really is that in some ways at the heart of the book is really one really fundamental question of inequality that is possibly, I'm not saying more unfair than the rest, but certainly one that is very personal and certainly discriminatory to you. It's a very personal book. I mean, if you look at the marriage chapter, it really does. It is very much at the heart of why you said. I think you I'm quoting from interview. You said I have to fight for equality, right? And I really wanted to talk to you really about that, about do you see the sort of same, let's say, same mindset about whether creating two different classes between the army officer and the ordinary citizen, and to extend that argument, do you see that as the same criteria between heterosexual marriage and in the sense, gay marriage? Do you think that is the same bias or discrimination that the courts have made, and what do you feel about that?
No, I think that's absolutely correct. As we decided and were discussing earlier, I was speaking, not discussing, sorry, that classification and what you see in two people is a value judgment.
Yeah.
And you say, well, these two people are worthy of being equated because they have this in common. But another judge may say, well, that which is in common is irrelevant, really, and will then strike down that classification. So, army officer, civilian, obviously to the judges in the 50s, there was a distinction. I had rather hoped that in 2024, well, of course, there's a difference between a straight couple and a queer couple or a non-heterosexual couple. There is. But does that distinction have anything to do with recognizing the right to live together as a couple, attendant with all its privileges that marriage brings, and attendant with the recognition of the state and the feeling that, your own country values your relationship, or it's treated as a second class kind of a relationship. So is this classification between straights and queers a reasonable one?
Yeah.
And the courts, I think, sadly, and very retrogressively, if I may say so, and they might have been almost behind their times, I think, if you actually scratch beneath the surface, said, yes, that's a valid distinction. And in doing so, I think they reverse engineered.
Yeah.
I think, had decided when you read the judgment that we don't want to give the right to marry. So we will create these two classes. We will then say these classes are different in respect of the purpose of marriage. The classes are different, but it has nothing to do with marriage, right? And more importantly, I think, in doing all this classification, making these, they ignored about 75 years of the jurisprudence of India.
Yeah.
Law has evolved. It's not that classification test, if it sounds odd, it's because it is odd. And it's been used rarely now. So the courts have moved on from this strict classification, grouping kind of a test into a more robust form of substantive inequality or substantive equality, that you look at historical discrimination and you say these groups have been historically discriminated, therefore equality requires us to push them up and bring them into a level playing field.
Yeah.
That's the idea of substantive equality. Is it rational? Is it arbitrary? Is it logical to treat these two separately? I mean, is there real basis to treat them separately? That's the test that the law has evolved. So you then wonder, if that is the test the law has evolved, why wasn't it used in the marriage equality case?
Yeah.
If not for reverse engineering. They decided we are going to treat you separately, so here, we'll apply this very narrow test, which gives us all the discretion, and then turn you away from the court saying, I feel so bad for you.
I mean, you deserve it, but we're not.
But someone else will do it. It's not my problem, it's someone else's.
So as one person said, it was not even breadcrumbs, right? It was not. So I wanted to ask you, if you look, and I wanted to quote from that, wait, I have to fish out my right glasses. And I wanted to ask you, if you read from what this judgment was, which was the Navdev Johar judgment, to now, okay, and that was ahead of its time in some ways. It was really poetry. Gosh, and I cannot read this. But essentially, it links the idea of equality to dignity, right? And the current Chief Justice basically says dignity is at the heart of all freedom. I mean, I'm sort of paraphrasing what he says. But how do you look at a point of time when, when society in 2018 wasn't really, when the striking down of 377 was pretty much a very revolutionary sort of step, right? You said that courts are not where revolution happen, but sometimes they do. How do you look at that point of time from 2018 when things were not as out of the closet to now in 2023? Why do you see that if society in some ways was ripe for this, why did the law not take that one step forward, we'd already taken that one step forward, which was a giant leap for mankind. So why not that tiny baby step forward too?
Well, let's unpack a couple of what you said things. First, I'm not sure society wasn't ready for it in 2018. We'd had the Naz Foundation judgment in 2009.
Yeah.
People had lived without Section 377. By people, I mean queer people, and of course, the society at large, from 2009 to 2013, and seen that society hadn't crumbled and fallen apart with this vicious foreign disease. But 2013, of course, that was overturned.
Yeah.
But from 2009 to 2018, having tasted that right, I think society became accustomed to it, right? Mm-hmm. It's like when you have your first glass sip of wine, it's not nice. And 9 years later, you grow to love your gin and tonic. Yeah. But you get used to something. Right? You get used to an idea, you accept it, it kind of filters and sets into society, which I think it had. It had not filtered in and set in the mindset of parliamentarians, right? 2018 was still a conservative parliament, as it is still today. And they did not think it fit to amend the law. But I think people were not that against the idea of decriminalizing homosexuality, right? Maybe not much more, but at least to that extent, let's not send people to jail for simply sleeping with someone else as you want to. But the judgment, of course, ended up doing more than that in 2018. So it did catch up to where people were, but you're right, it also pushed the envelope a bit.
Yeah.
It didn't just say that, okay, if you want to sleep with someone in the privacy of your bedroom, there, go do it. We won't, the law can't stop you. They instead realized that being queer is not just about the physical act of having sex. It is very much a part of that. Let's not desexualize any conversation. I think as it is, we are a nation of prudes, and we are becoming more and more prudish, and we are restraining ourselves more and more. So let's talk about the fact that, yes, being queer is about sex. But it's not just about sex. That's important. And they emphasize the fact that it's about your dignity, your ability to walk with your head held high, knowing that you're an equal citizen. Right? The discrimination the queer community faced was not just the existence of Section 377, which criminalized one kind of sex but not the other, but it was the discrimination in every other sphere of life that you faced.
It gave you legitimacy. It allowed it legitimacy. It gave you. I mean, a rose by any other name is a rose, is what it started with, right? So essentially,
call me who I am, so take me as I am, but take me as I am,
Yeah.
right? That's what the Chief Justice Mishra said. And yes, there's a lot of poetic writing in that book, but it was ultimately, as you said, about dignity. And I think it takes me back to the first question you asked about, is equality the non-sexy right? And isn't freedom more fun? I would kind of see it as some kind of a cocktail.
Yeah, you can't have one without the other, right?
You have all these rights, and if it just takes some away, you won't have dignity. So we've talked about freedom, we've talked about equality, you talked about justice, you talked about dignity. I would add to that mix autonomy, the right to take a decision about yourself and not have someone else take those decisions for you. There are multiple rights, all these rights which make us human. If you take any one of them away, the entire, as I said, structure will collapse. And you don't have that dignity, and you will not have justice at the end of the day. That's what our preamble says, the Constitution. These are not things I'm just making up while sitting here. This was incorporated in our preamble in 1950, that you have all these rights, justice, liberty, equality, so as to ensure the dignity for the individual, so that the unity of the country will be guaranteed. These are the words of the preamble. So they understand 75 years ago, something we seem to have forgotten, actually, is that the unity of the country is not threatened by fundamental rights, it is guaranteed by those fundamental rights. And the unit of those fundamental rights is the individual, and it's her dignity which is really relevant. And that dignity will not come without equality, will not come without freedom, will not come without fear. You said earlier that I've written and I've said, and I proudly say that if I want equality, I have to fight for it. I think we've forgotten how to fight for our rights. We've become a bit lazy about it. And it's also become, what kind of jhola wala kind of thing are you doing? But we all need to be activists in whichever way we can do it.
So you talk about yourself being an accidental activist. How does that happen?
Well, I have a day job.
And you apparently also write, as you said, while everybody else drinks coffee and gossips in court, you sit and write.
You have to be fairly disciplined about it, I have a colleague here in the audience, she's probably seen me. So I just take my laptop and I run away somewhere else. So my day job is that of a lawyer. And I am a senior counsel in court, and that my hours are crazy. As anyone doing any kind of job, I'm not more hallowed than anyone else. I'm not working harder than anyone else. All of us work hard. But my activism, which of course stems from a personal cause, which is the discrimination I faced as a queer individual, moves me to do something about it. And the way I feel I can do something about it is by just awakening the inner activist in everybody. Just, fiery comment I made just now that you have to fight for your rights. It's kind of true, because in doing so, you will improve the lives of everybody you know. You will improve the state of the country. You will also inevitably end up improving my life, because I'm part of this country. But it's just all in all a good thing, So that's important, I think. But writing, Right.
So, you've talked about being discriminated against, and I think that so it's been the collegium has accepted 5 times, right? I think 5 times the file has gone up and down. I'm not mistaken. Has it gone for the 6th time?
I'll run out of fingers by the time this is over.
But, and last year again, the collegium said that, that they would love you to be a judge. And I wanted to repeat what Justice Gupta said. I think there was a piece where he said that I think it is about being old-fashioned. So can you really talk about that? I mean, about actually being cleared by your peers, about being considered as someone who deserves it, but yet being discriminated or being left out because, we're too old-fashioned to have an openly gay Chief Justice. Sorry, not Chief Justice, but a judge.
Well, there's definitely a part of the fact that you are old-fashioned. That comes from, I think, a prejudice, which in turn stems from a lack of education, as most prejudice does. You hate someone else because you're fearful of them. And you're probably fearful of them because you just don't know enough about them. And you start spreading myths and rumors, and they eat cats in Ohio to they're reproducing so fast that our country so that our country's demographics will change. All kinds of myths float about, and you start having these prejudices and hatreds. So yes, it is very much, and sometimes the prejudice is clothes. We read in the Bible or we read elsewhere in wolf in sheep's clothing, that you'll find some other excuse. So maybe it's not the sexuality, but it's your foreign partner. Who's the wife of the foreign minister of India who's signing secret document? Well, let's leave that aside. Yeah. But obviously it's old-fashioned because they come from a certain milieu. Not only that, but from a certain mindset, I think, right? It's not as though every old person is a bigot. That's simply not true. It's not as though every middle class or a poorer person has not got the vision. They certainly do, maybe sometimes more. But it is about a certain set of individuals, undoubtedly, who reign through an expression of an ideology which does not have within it a room for diversity and a multiplicity of opinion. And I think that's partly what they fear more than my sexuality. It's the same lot of people who will comment on my sexuality who will say Hijras and Kinnars are demigods. And they will go to the akhadas in Kumbh Mela and say, we worship you. And will call the Hijras at the time of the children's blessing and you say, oh, you are goddess, we worship you. So it's not just that. I think it is the disruptive idea of what it means not to conform to the ideology and the norm that they have, which is problematic. This is what I can guess. I don't know. There's no other way for me to explain it because being queer is no longer a crime after 2018. And हमारे संग पे तो सिर पे सिंह नहीं है. But so what is it? If you deconstruct, that's probably what it is.
The fear of being different.
The fear of allowing someone different to come into place and be seen as a person who exists and can wield power without causing a destruction wholesale of society per se. If one person can be different, why can't everybody be different? This is this idea which I think is problematic. The demand for equality is not a demand for uniformity, right? As
yes, but I think you talk about the fact that there is a fear of this idea of uniformity that is coming in. Whether it is, and can you talk a little bit about that? About the fact
I talk about that in the case of the hijab.
Yeah.
Right. Personally, I think wearing the hijab is deeply problematic because it is probably not stemming from when you cover yourself or a burqa or a hijab.
It's about the gaze.
Yes, it is, and it's about controlling a man's gaze on the woman.
Yeah.
So the woman takes the responsibility upon herself. So it's problematic slightly hijab. So I'm not one of those who says no, let it carry on. But what I'm asking for is reform within the community.
Yeah.
Right? So many of these reforms have to come from within. If you push it from the top down, it will just have a completely different impact. But that's a different point. The judgment that the hijab, Karnataka banned the hijab in schools, and the matter went to court. There was a split verdict. One judge upholding the ban, one judge striking down the ban. But the judgment of the judge upholding the ban was interesting and I think dangerous, if I may say so. Because they said that he turned the idea of equality on its head. And to me, equality means the ability to be different yet be treated equally by the state, right? He turned that around and said, no, what equality means that everyone must be equal. So you must all wear the same uniform, you must all look the same, you must all dress the same. There's a desire for absence of any variation in human beings. And that he turned and said, that's the requirement of equality. Article 14 requires everyone to be the same, which is, of course, not true at all. Because you're requiring conformity as a constitutional principle when its purpose is exactly the reverse. It is a protection for the people who are not equal to be treated as equally. If you're going to conform, you don't need protection, do you? You don't need a right when you're part of a political majority. That's the idea of a fundamental right enforced by an unelected judiciary who people claim, what is their moral legitimacy, is precisely this. When you value an individual's right to choose for herself, her pace in life, her desires, then you also require a protection of that right, because that right or that decision is often going to be in the face of what the majority wants, right? And if the majority is politically powerful, they're going to come down on you like a ton of bricks. So at that point, the courts step in as the protective barrier and say, well, yes, the majority does not want you to exercise your choice, and we are here to ensure that you get that right to exercise your choice. So this judgment was just completely shorn of all constitutional principle, which unfortunately, I have to say, I'm finding more and more in our judgments.
So very much that I may disagree with you vehemently, but I will protect your right to be able to disagree, your right to be able to say what you have to.
As Voltaire
has famously quoted it.
I don't know whether he actually said it or not, but I will.
Well, we don't know. But I mean, there's fake news. It says on Twitter, and we'll just believe Twitter in this moment. So I wanted to ask you really about this in some ways that drawing from that, if we look at the triple talaq judgment, and you say that there is an aspect of guaranteeing equality there, but it comes from a different space. It comes from a space of, in some ways, in a different way of looking at the hijab issue, where you're saying it doesn't exist in the religion. The religion interprets it differently, so therefore it comes from that space, right? And it just comes from also the idea of what all laws, this thing is, that to protect the family, right? So can you talk about that in the aspect of, in some ways, and this is a conversation we had, right, where we said that we linked equality and we linked the idea of how equality, how freedom of expression cannot happen without equality, especially when it comes to gender, right? And can you talk a little bit about how you see, in some ways, the guarantee of rights for women don't necessarily come as the right over your body, for example, for abortion, but it comes from a different space. And how do you look at that aspect? Could we actually counter that aspect of patriarchy ever?
Well, I'd say in terms of the hijab judgment, let's just quickly get that and see as to what the basis of that was. And the triple talaq judgment. Hijab, I've explained. Triple talaq. Triple talaq, as we all know, Muslim man saying talaq, talaq, talaq to his wife, and there talaq happens. The wife cannot do that. She cannot say talaq, talaq, talaq to husband, and their divorce happens. It's obviously discriminatory, right? And you would think that a constitution that guarantees equality, that would be an anathema, and that would be struck down, because how can the man do it and not the woman? Matter goes to court. 5 judges sit and hear it. Not one of those 5 struck down the law on this ground. Not one of them said this. That it's because a man can do it and the woman, therefore we're striking down this law. And the reason is they say that personal laws are actually immune from constitutional scrutiny. Because it's personal law, we're not going to get into this, we're going to have a hands-off approach. Instead, by a majority of 3-2, of the 3 majority, 2 said that, well, it's arbitrary. You know, you can't just simply one day decide and say, I'm going to divorce my wife and say, talak, talak, talak. It's absolutely arbitrary. So we can't have a provision like that. And the deciding judge, because there's 2-2 judgment, says that it is un-Islamic.
Yeah.
Doesn't say that it's discriminatory to women. It says it's un-Islamic. It's not recognized by the Sharia, by the Islamic law. Therefore, we strike it down. So again, a provision which is clearly about women is discussed, yet women are not discussed in it.
Yeah.
As so often is the case, you are invisibilized.
Yes.
Right? That's what happens with discrimination. That's what happens with inequality. The queer people were pushed into the closet, invisible. Women were made to sit in their homes, not seen either in the hijab or in the parda or in the homes, not seen, invisible, not in the public sphere. The lower castes have no jobs in the upper echelons of corporate India, or indeed, we've never had a Dalit prime minister. Invisibilized. So that is the problem of inequality. And when you talk of gender justice and how inequality translates to that, and that is the link, I think, between the freedom of expression and inequality. The ability to speak, to be seen, to be heard, to be noticed, to demand to be noticed.
Yes.
Right? So that is, if you don't have the freedom of expression, you're not allowed to speak. Or if you do, you don't have the podium that anyone that you can speak from, or people are not paying attention to you because you're seen as someone irrelevant and unworthy of being paid attention to. That's an invisibilization. That's a violation of the freedom of expression. And that happens because you are unequal.
Yeah.
Because you're seen as a woman and you're not worthy of the words you're saying. So these are all tied into how we have stereotypes about people.
Yeah.
Right? So much of the problem about discrimination against women is stereotypical. Women drive badly. Women are going to quit a job and because they're going to get pregnant and not work. These are stereotypical assumptions. To some extent, some may be true. For instance, a woman is going to get pregnant. She is going to leave her job.
Or she doesn't want to have children. That's also
that's also fine. But if she does, the answer is not to take that stereotypical imagination and say, I'm going to run with it and discriminate against an already discriminated class further by not hiring you. The answer is to make provisions instead for women, to give them maternity leave, which is greater than it currently exists, ensuring that when you come back, you have extra skill development, that is not seen as a break in your service. There are multiple things that are required to be done. That tough task is unfortunately not done.
Or you're going to send Lapata Lady to the Oscars and say that women are submissive and this thing. So, I mean, I think there is an aspect of stereotypical views of women completely. But I wanted to ask, I wanted to talk about really the idea of identity politics. And the fact that the next battle, whether the judges are ready or not, whether society is ready or not, is going to really be this frontier. If you look at what is happening in Calcutta with Ajikar, where you look at what is happening in what happened with Nirbhaya, that moment where where there is 50% of the population that says, listen, but it's, or how Me Too goes with saying where you look at sexism and say sexism is equally sort of tainted as sexual harassment. Do you think, or the debate between trans and this thing that J.K. Rowling is guilty of, how do you see that space within the law? Do you think that, if you look at the marriage equality judgment, the disappointment that existed, do you think that essentially that society will change, will find ways to resist, will find alternate dissing, and the law will have to take a course? How do you look at the change that is happening instantaneously, and how do you think the law is going to look at it?
I got the multiple things in what
yes,
you
multiple
said.
Questions, yes.
Yes, multiple. So let me just also meander about.
Yes.
I'll start with the last part about what you said, about the interaction between law and society.
Yeah.
And that to me is fascinating as to how do we change society, and can law force itself upon society and have its will expressed, and you will do as I say and not as you wish to do. And that's a complex one. After all, law is a set of moral rules about what should be.
But so my question is, in some ways, if I sort of probe a little this thing, so for example, in under a ruling, living couples who conduct themselves in society as couples do not necessarily need to be married, have the legitimate stamp of having a ceremony, but will still be seen as married when it comes to wills, so for example, right? So, I mean, in some ways, the law is caught up with that. But so how does, so, you know, in that case, for example, in the ruling of the living couple, it was much ahead of what is even acceptable as society. So how do you sort of...
I think you're probably referring to the judgment which about the domestic violence case, the Domestic Violence Act. There is a statute which recognizes...
No, wasn't there where there was a judgment where it said where you lived in couple? It was a case about this woman whose husband already was married to her, and he was actually living with somebody else, and they'd been living with each other for like X number of years, and the court ruled that because she was seen as his wife, the other one who was estranged from him does not. I mean, or she was equally. I mean, she was deserved equal. She had equal rights over his property as the first wife.
See, in terms of intestate succession, which is that you can of course will your property to whoever.
Yeah. In this case, I think he was.
Yes, but if you don't have your will and you die without a will, then if you are not married and you have a wife, sorry, but the unmarried partner will not inherit. I think you have certain rights, as I said, under the DV Act, a right of residence. You'll carry on being able to reside there because you can show that you are in a relationship akin to marriage.
Yeah.
That's the language used.
I think akin to marriage,
That's the language used in the Act. But nevertheless, you as the partner, unmarried partner, will not inherit. However, your children, they're no longer illegitimate children, and they will inherit they will inherit. So this was about also possibly the rights of the children.
Yeah.
And there I'd say, well, the law has moved on, yes.
Yes.
But you know, it's recognized certain parts of the rights, but it's a couple has always the option to get married, right? Unless, of course, you're already married, you don't have a divorce. But if you're two unmarried people living together, you have that option. You choose not to do it, and the law will nevertheless still provide you some comfort, guarantees that you will not be thrown out of your house, your children will still inherit. And then you look at the queer community. Now, I want to get married to my partner, but I can't. So not only can I not get married, it will ensure that you do not have any rights of succession. It will ensure that when you adopt a child, only one parent can be the father or the mother, and the other partner cannot. They're legally a stranger to their own children. And see injustice of that. And this was one of the cases that we brought to court of two friends, who were friends of mine as well. I'm not going to name them. So it was the sperm of the two of them mixed up, and they had twins. The biological father of each of their two children, each has a separate father, the partner. But now, if that were just to be allowed as it is, there would be one father, one child, another father, another child. The fathers are not related. The children are not related to each other. They're not brothers and sisters, right? Because they belong to two unrelated fathers.
Yeah.
So this father gave up his child in adoption to the other to his partner, so that they could be seen as at least siblings. At least the two kids are siblings of each other. But in the process, is now not the parent of any child.
Yeah.
And the law countenances this. Now, how can that be? How can we live in a constitution in a country which says all these fancy things in its rather long, some would say verbose constitution, and you say this is okay? surely it's a smell test. If this can pass constitutional muster, if this kind of injustice can be allowed to carry on, there's something wrong. And if the courts say, well, it's so sad, best of luck trying to get Parliament to do something, we ain't going to do anything about it, honey.
But we'll give you a hotline.
Yeah. And we'll give you speeches,
yes.
We'll give you lectures, we will also go to other places and give speeches and lectures, wax eloquent at everywhere, but where it matters, i.e. our judgment. Then there's a problem.
But it's also not only about adoption in some ways, and it is also about being able to make decisions for each other. So, for example, and I think that's where it is. I have two friends who said that, Mandira, the only thing the only thing I wish is that supposing something happens to my partner, I should be able to make decisions, health decisions, medical decisions. Both of us are of a certain age. It's all right if the family understands, but why should I have to depend on an understanding family? Why should I not be able to say, you know what, I'm not saying take her off the ventilator, but essentially, can I sign? Can I say that you can put in an IV? Can I say that you can sign for an operation?
Absolutely. We recently had a case just about a few months ago about this gay couple in Kerala, and one partner died. He fell off the roof and wanted then to take the body and have it cremated, and the partner was estranged from his family. And when the surviving partner went to the hospital and said, all right, can I have the body? I would like to now. The hospital refused to give the body to the surviving partner, saying instead that, no, you go and look for this estranged family who hated their child.
Yeah.
Right? They didn't want anything to do with it. Now, that is just appalling. Not only does discrimination suffuse your life with prejudice while you're alive, it follows you after death. It doesn't let you go. I mean, there's no escape from discrimination. And that's what the job of the courts is to step in. You gave the example of medical decisions. As I said, being queer in India isn't easy. I had a great coming out experiences. Most people don't. A lot of people have terrible relationships with their family, especially if they come from small town India or they come from a rural background. They're not in certain areas. Even the rich sometimes can just ostracize their children. And then to say that person finds a partner, and as you said, need an emergency, you take them there, you need emergency surgery, that you're now going to try to trace out this other family who hates you, probably wants you to die in any case. They'll never give consent, or they will oust you as a partner from taking a decision. You won't be allowed to see the person you loved for all these years, even access their bedside. I mean, that is heart-wrenching. And it is real. This has happened in COVID to multiple people I know.
Yeah.
This is not just some strange story. I mean, we talked earlier this trans and trans athletes. That's alien. I mean, that doesn't happen in India. We beat ourselves about, look, what do trans people need these rights? What about trans people in sports? That's not an Indian problem. We talk about I have heard people say, oh, it's also woke. I know someone who wants to identify as a cat. Can we allow that? I don't know anyone who wants to identify as a cat. It doesn't exist. You've read about it somewhere on Twitter. It does not exist. A gay man not having access to their partner because their family doesn't want it, that exists. Let's deal with that problem.
Yeah. So, you're going back to the book. In some ways, the book is a manifesto, sort of a urgent, sort of a plea, really, for everybody to read the Constitution, certainly take equality very seriously, and in some ways become, well, not an accidental activist, but a certainly aware activist in a way, right? And I wanted to talk to you about, of course, what can aam aadmi do and an aam aurat do? But before that, I just wanted to ask you, as a lawyer, as someone who sees, I mean, of course, you don't look at petitions of PILs necessarily, but do you think that the way that people access the justice system from the 1950s, where you were flooded with PILs and, where you have a certain engagement and a belief that, that I must remedy this because this is essential and this is essential for India, this is essential, this sort of deep commitment to the idea of the Constitution being this bulwark and protection sort of thing. From then to now, do you see that same engagement with trying to fight injustice? And then, of course, what can an armed order do with this manifesto that you've just written?
See, the compact between the Indian citizen and her relationship with the state has changed over the last 75 years. The nationalistic fervor and zeal that you had in 1950, that idealism that you had in 1950, that, together we will improve our lot and get better, also made demands, of course, of the people who were the most disadvantaged. And I talk about that. So, for instance, religious minorities, as almost to prove their allegiance to the Constitution, were required to give up quotas, which they had. Instead, quotas were given to the scheduled castes and tribes. But there was that particular idealistic still belief that you have a relationship with the state, and the state will protect you, and you have to fight for that state and make that country better. That's changed, of course, over the 75 years. It has mutated into a kind of a nationalism, I think, that now exists, which makes demands of you, of the state, rather than guaranteeing you rights. So your relationship with the state, rather than as one where you contribute towards the upliftment of the country, has become kind of like a my-baap state, where the state will dole out privileges. And if you don't toe the line, if you don't follow the tax collector's demands, do this, you will be ostracized, right? So I think our relationship with the state has also become transactional a bit, and literally transactional, sadly, in case of tax demands. That's how it is. I think the corruption that we've seen in the last 75 years has actually hollowed out and shaped, therefore, also the relationship with the state and the individual, because you're not getting the promised idealistic things of 1950. So, as a consequence, I think it is all the more important for us to rise above this transactional relationship we have with the state, and maybe not become an activist. Not everyone can become, not everyone should become. I mean, what will I do? Actually, I'll just rest and relax.
But if everybody becomes an activist and sort of comes and says, we want this thing, doesn't it make it become more egalitarian in this thing?
See, we're all activists without opinions, and we're all opinion holders without information, and we're all having information without any discretion.
You're basically describing Twitter.
Yes, but that's not just Twitter, the internet. I'm sorry. But while it is a great enabling tool, the net, those of us who were born from a time prior to the net, we used to have editorial discretion that was exercised, and I didn't get information, I got news.
Yeah.
And I no longer get news, I get information, but I don't necessarily have the tools to be able to go through that information and make a decision as to what is valid, what is not valid. I am irritated when on Twitter, a random bot, not even human, will have the same 140 characters as someone who has applied their mind for decades to develop a nuanced point of view. So we're in that polarized space. So I would then say, when you may not become an activist, not everyone needs to become an activist, not everyone can, but at least become an informed citizen.
Yeah.
You all know the Miranda rights. We all see these movies, you have the right to remain silent, if anything you say will be used against you. We see that. Do you know your rights under the Indian Constitution in the similar situation? Probably not. It's a bit absurd that you know the American Constitution and your rights, but you don't know the Indian Constitution. Do you know what happens if the policeman stops you on the road? What are your rights? No. So please, kindly, pick up some text and read it. Of course, we lawyers have not made our task any easier. We speak in language, we write in language, we deal in language, which is almost, it seems, deliberately exclusionary.
Yeah.
To understand legalese is sometimes difficult even for me. I mean, you talk to the judgment, 377 judgment.
Yeah.
The lead judgment was written by Chief Justice Deepak Mishra. He was also the one who wrote the judgment upholding the constitutional validity of the criminal defamation. And the first 2 pages of that judgment were 1 paragraph in a single sentence. Now,
Well, certainly it's James Joyce. James Joyce, right?
James Joyce, yes, exactly. Yes, correct. But he's no James Joyce, right?
Have you read Ulysses?
I tried and I gave up for the same reason that I gave up.
Dubliners.
Yes.
Try that first.
Yeah, but I gave up because I also gave up reading Justice Mishra's judgment. So we write in language is exclusionary. You know, legal language is not accessible to everybody, so it's to us as well. But if that's what's happened, you've still got to find sources that will explain the law to you.
Which is exactly why you should get who is equal. And at that, I think we'll open up for questions. Anybody got questions?
I got one. Can I get another gin?
Yeah.
Sorry. The constitution of most countries was written by highly privileged people, mostly men, long time back. And most of the laws of countries are, using that as a North Star. Isn't that a problem that manifests itself again and again?
You've hit on a very interesting point. Our constitution was made by the Constituent Assembly. What's interesting and what people often don't realize is that the Constituent Assembly was not an elected body. It was the provincial legislatures across India which elected the members of the Constituent Assembly indirectly. So rather the way Rajya Sabha is elected, right? So you have state assemblies electing an MP for a Rajya Sabha, is how the members of the Constituent Assembly were elected. That's not all, because that would also mean at least some elected person is electing in turn the Constituent Assembly. The provincial assemblies were elected on the basis of limited franchise. So there were property requirements, there were educational requirements. So it wasn't universal adult franchise. Not everyone above the age of 18 could vote. So it was very limited electorate. I think the figure is almost only about 20% of India was eligible to vote. So these 20% of the people vote for the provincial assemblies, who in turn vote for the Constituent Assembly. And then it gets worse. After the Constituent Assembly is constituted, India and Pakistan get split. And almost all the Muslim members of the constituent of that assembly leave and they go to Pakistan because they're elected from there. So there are virtually no Muslims left in the Constituent Assembly. There are only rich upper caste Hindu men. So then you co-opt certain people. Dr. Ambedkar famously was brought in, certain Muslims were brought in. Nevertheless, it's an elite group. But I'd say one thing about the elites of that time at least, that they had within their hearts, I think, a desire to build a better India. They'd all gone and suffered the yoke of colonialism. They may have been elites, they may have studied in Eton, Harrow, Cambridge, Oxford, which they had, but they'd also gone to prison. They'd also traveled across the country. They were also advised by a large number of people, particularly Dr. Ambedkar, who we owe a great debt of gratitude to. You know, people say he's a hack because he took the 1935 Government of India Act and lifted it bodily into the Constitution. Answer, no. There was a lot of work that went in. And why look at just the upper caste, elitist men who framed the discussion? Dr. Rajendra Prasad, I mean, there's many come to mind. But also look at Dr. Ambedkar. And they gave us something that the constitution of any country should be. Rather than being a detailed script of A, B, C, D, most importantly, they gave us a set of tools about what it means to be a person, individual, who lives in an open and secular society. They gave us principles by which we have to live. So the idea of equality of everybody, Article 14, expressed in very general terms, the way the 14th Amendment is in the US Constitution. The broadest language that has been used, the prohibition of untouchability in Article 17. These are all principles that have been given which are timeless. They're taken from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They form part of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. These are not just elite concepts which only an elite person is thrusting upon, unwilling, unsuspecting, uninformed, poor rural population. These are concepts about, while you may not have the privilege of exercising them as a poorest person, is something you realize that poorest person should also have. So I think while they were elitist, I think they were acutely conscious of that fact, that they were elitist, and they attempted to remedy that by, as I said, co-opting people who were not elites, but also giving these lofty principles of equality. It was easy for the elites to not give reservations. It was easy for the elite not to have universal adult franchise. There was discussion in the Constituent Assembly saying, why are we giving an uneducated electorate who will vote in idiots? Maybe some truth. There was a discussion, and that was shot down precisely maybe because of, as maybe I also have, the guilt to the privileged. You realize what was the right thing to do, and they did the right thing, I think. So yes, by some hook or by crook and some miracle, we have today a constitution which is just and fair, and I hope it isn't incurred too much by those who claim to be less elitist, because no one sitting in parliament today is anything but elite.
Another question? Yes. Do you want? There. The mic is coming.
On the one hand, as you've said, we have a robust and a great constitution. Then how do you account for the fact that we have so many acts of parliament being passed which are patently unconstitutional in nature, fundamentally constitutional, and they are being implemented? I mean, I have to name a few. Many sections of UAPA are deemed to be unconstitutional. No one has challenged it, but then neither has the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court is implementing those unconstitutional sections. We also had the same thing in the PMLA. I mean, I could name so many of them. And the other question I wanted to pose to you, isn't this contrary to the basic structure doctrine? And the fact is that the basic structure doctrine is being subverted almost on a daily basis, with acts being passed, with executive orders which are contrary to it, and no one does anything. The Supreme Court keeps, to my mind, sleeping over it.
Well, unconstitutional laws are being passed because parliaments love to pass unconstitutional laws, right? Every political party, anywhere in the world, not just the present dispensation, but even the Congress Party of the 50s and 60s, they want to suppress individual liberties. That's how you rule, right? You rule by oppression, almost. It sounds like a totalitarian, horrible state, but that is the instinct of power, to control, right? So this has always happened. Unconstitutional laws have always been passed. It is the role of the courts to step in and try to stop that. That is what the Constitution says. So the Constitution is robust. The Constitution has given you a mechanism by saying, hello, Mr. Court, please, and I say Mr. Court deliberately because there are hardly any women judges in the Supreme Court, just one left now, Justice Nagaratna. Please strike down these unconstitutional laws. But another thing that the powerful executive does is overawe. It overawes the courts by making arguments which are almost quasi-threatening. And we have seen, sadly, maybe in the time of the emergency as one example, is that when you have an intensely powerful government, the courts back off. El Kedwani very famously said, and maybe it should be repeated to him now, is that they were asked to bend, they crawled, right? Maybe a different context, but same question. So they're not standing up, I think, the courts, sadly, to a robust idea of what it means to strike down an unconstitutional act. The PMLA is one very good example. I think it is single-handedly destroying large swathes of business in our country. It has converted a business person who is only trying to manipulate the maze which is Indian bureaucracy, trying to earn money. I mean, you cannot in this country, as a lawyer, I can say, my prime work is as a commercial lawyer. You cannot possibly follow all the rules that are promulgated, right? And to add to that, they add this draconian act, the PMLA, converting the way queer people were converted all into criminals by Section 377. Virtually every businessman and a businesswoman has been converted into a criminal by a PMLA. And it should be struck down. Yes, it's not been. UAPA, of course. The whole bail, oh, fantastic. We can go on for another half an hour. I'm a fuel. Yes, the UAPA is BNS, BNSS, and whatever else. Yes, I can't even. Well, there are problems with those acts, but.
But do you want to talk about it?
Well, it's old wine in new bottles, basically. So there's hardly been any change, other than there was an opportunity for there to be reform of our criminal justice system, which is crying for reform. It needs reform. It needs greater rights for the individual. It needs speedier trials. None of that has been given, other than a name which is virtually unpronounceable by most lawyers. So all of us still say Indian IPC and Evidence Act. You can't. You've taken away protections for the queer community. Section 377, even while it was struck down, was something useful for in case of male rape.
Yeah.
That's gone. Now you can have that. So there is a certain thoughtlessness. I don't know whether it exists at the parliamentary level, but I think that's putting too much credence there. I think this exists more at the committee level, and the draftspersons of the various laws are not the brightest.
And we have somebody there. The mic goes there.
Do you think part of the reason why we haven't really had the kind of conversations around equality also because somewhere over the time period when this PIL rules was coming in, we sort of got too dependent on our court system. Because I'm just trying to draw a contrast here. Ma'am mentioned the basic structure. At a very fundamental level, that's also some unelected judge saying you can't change the constitution, which is nowhere in the world for you. Why should we not be able to change the constitution if it's not constitutional? So, and if you compare us to, say, the US, where the recent abortion case happened, you saw how there was so many petitions, and a lot of states have actually reformed their law more permanently than any judgment ever could. So somewhere have we sort of become very complacent and more dependent on our courts in that sense. And that's sort of taken away from this conversation that you need to have at a society and at a political level to have real equality in a society.
Well, to that, I'd say, what option does a citizen have? Right? A citizen has no option but to go to court and file a PIL, because you can hardly go to your local MP and expect a hearing from them, right?
Sorry to interrupt, but if you just think about how different democracies operate, right? We don't even know our MPs, but in the UK they call their MPs all the time.
Yes.
So somewhere we've lost that touch with the political side of things, and we're more on the judicial side.
Yes, but that's inevitable, right? You have 540 MPs in a country of 1.4 billion. Each of average size of a constituency, some 30 million people. How will you have that interaction with your MP? You can't. You could quadruple or make your number of MPs 10 times, and still that relationship that you have with your MP is not going to happen. So you can't compare yourself to the UK, where the size of the constituency is much smaller. 650 constituencies for a population of about like 100 million. You can't compare that. So because of the way our democracy functions, and given that distance that you have between the elected representative and the individual, look, the first way to change any society is through law which is passed by Parliament and enforced by the executive. That's plan A. Plan A hasn't worked in India. So you go to plan B, which is the courts. That's why the court stepped in by way of the public interest litigation. If you have a problem today, because there is a take her outside a school where your child goes and studies, are you going to go and complain to the executive and think something's going to happen? Are you going to write to your MP or your MLA and think something's going to happen? No, it's not going to happen, right? Because democracy has failed that way, because we're not truly representative. The numbers are just too large. The distance is too great. You will, however, file a petition in the High Court, and the court will then say, that's what the courts have done. They've become another space of participatory democracy. I think that's important to recognize. The marriage equality judgment, when we were talking about that, the hearings were happening. They were being live streamed by YouTube into every home. Whether you agree with it or you disagree with it, you became a participant in that discussion. Right? You didn't have to be in court to argue the case. I mean, the atmosphere was electric and sometimes horrific. I was there. But even otherwise, sitting in the comfort of your home, you could see what was happening. You became engaged in the discussion. You knew someone who could maybe file a petition who would then be heard in court, and your voice would be counted. And that's all what you really want as human beings, right? For our voice to be counted. And the courts are the only place where that happens, sadly. Is it ideal? No. Is it plan B? Certainly. But, to get rid of PILs and hope instead that plan A will somehow miraculously work, it ain't going to happen. The basic structure doctrine, I see great value in that, but that's a discussion for another time.
Yeah.
You call yourself an accidental activist and talk about a very important concept of having the voice of the unheard. Is there another topic close to your heart that you would be picking up in the near future?
You're talking about my next book? I just spoke to my publisher yesterday. I got itchy fingers. I typed very fast. Well, no. I want to write a book, which I'm thinking of. Pratik doesn't know. He's from Penguin. A book called Are We Free? The aim, I find, is, as I said, to tell people about their rights, to make them reflect about what is it that we've become, what is it that we wish to be, neither of which is possible to know that what is the lay of the land. So I give you a lay of the land or the law of the land. So the next book will be about freedom, and something that is very dear to me, as it is to everybody. Not just free speech. As I said, that's the sexy right that everyone speaks about. I've used that several times now.
Well, it is like catching, right? The sexy white right that everybody speaks of.
But it's not just about free speech. A simple thing like right to assemble, and we all have faced tremendous problems with the Sindhu border, with Shaheen Bagh, roads being blocked. That's a right to assembly. What are their rights versus my right to traverse on that road? When these rights clash, I just will drive and save 10 minutes of my day. That person's identity to fight for what she believes in would be taken away. So I'm not saying that's necessarily a good thing. I'm not sure that blocking a whole road for years to come is the right way to go about it.
Do you know now, actually, there isn't anybody at the Sindhu border, but it's still a border. So, and I think in that way, there is an aspect of a different question about whether we put borders into where do we draw a border? And, there is a discrimination and sort of invisibilization in some ways, or peripherization in a different way itself.
The whole Radcliffe line was an artificial border, which
completely
causes all the problems, right?
Yeah. Yes. And it is the same, because there isn't anybody, but you still have that border, and it's a mental border, not necessarily a physical border. And then you have created a border within. You've sort of created a periphery when it didn't exist. Well,
that's exactly what I think about freedom as well, right? The chilling effect that we all have.
Yeah.
We all self-censor, especially in the last 10 years, I wonder why. You're careful about what you say. You think back 15 years ago, you didn't stop yourself from saying half the things you don't say today because you're scared of the consequence. And I'm afraid this is a lesson that has been learned by every political party. This is not me chastising the current dispensation alone. You wait and see. If they go, the Congress comes in, it will be the same thing.
Yeah.
The worst habits are learnt most quickly.
Samvidhan, right? And the people who actually voted to sort of put in or change it or to sort of protect it from being changed were actually the people who felt the possibility of caste most, who were not sitting in this room necessarily, who actually where inequality was where mattered the most. So they were the most unequal, and yet they voted to protect this fundamental thing. While we're sitting here and discussing it in this thing where we don't necessarily feel the impact of it, or well, if we do, we still have a privilege of sort of a get out of jail pass.
You fight when you have a lot to gain or a lot to lose.
Yeah.
Either which way. So you fight for your freedom because you have a lot to lose. You vote in a particular way because you hope, right? The audacity of hope, to use President Obama's
yes.
words, is I think that what drove maybe some part of this election, but that's maybe a political theorist writing rather than me chatting about it with my armchair activism.
And gin and tonic. Yes, thank you so much.